Lesson 8.5, Video 1. As mentioned, the quadratic formula's method of solving a quadratic equation gives us roots as answers. The process pushing us towards the quadratic formula was solving by rooting. Completing the square allows us to solve by rooting. So we're going to look at a couple examples here, but before we start, we want to make sure we understand a little observation. If I give you this trinomial, and we are asked to factor it, we have x first. We're looking for two numbers that have a product of 64 and a sum of 16. And that would be 8 and 8. Now notice that this is a special kind of trinomial because when you factor it, you have the same thing in each parentheses, which allows us to do a very important thing. We can write it as one binomial squared, and that'll come into play later. But the question at hand is, how does the 8 relate to the 64 and the 16? How do they relate to each other? And some basic observations are that 16 divided by 2 is equal to 8. Or, if you want to write it this way, you can. 8 times 2 is 16. The square root of 64 is 8. Or in other words, 8 squared is 64. And we're going to use that characteristic and that quality to complete the square. And by completing the square means that we're trying to create a trinomial that is a perfect square, so that when you factor it, you can write it like that. So here we're asked, solve each equation by taking the square root of each side. Now, first of all, let's see if we can factor the trinomial. On the left, if we factor it, now it says solve by taking the square root of each side. So that I'm going to assume that this is going to be factorable as is. And here we're looking for two numbers that have a product of 100 and a sum of 20. And that would be 10 and 10. Notice that you have to have a sum of negative 20, so they would be negative 10 and negative 10. Again, notice that the trinomial is a perfect square, or is a perfect trinomial, because when you factor it, you get the same thing in each binomial, which allows us to do a very important thing. I can write it as one binomial squared. And now we're back to the questions we had before. How do we solve this? Well, you have the square isolated on one side, even though if it's a binomial, it's okay. So we can undo the square and get x minus 10 equals, and again, very important, because of the way it's written, it is a plus minus 6. We would then add 10 to both sides. And our answer is x equals 10 plus or minus 6, which is 10 plus 6, which is 16, and it's 10 minus 6, which is 4. And those are your two answers. So again, we have a question that says solve by taking the square root of each side, which gives me a clue that the trinomial on the left side is factorable. So we try it, and that's what we came up with. And this ends Lesson 8.5, Video 1.